Descriptive statistics. So we use descriptive statistics when we want to identify what is. We're just trying to describe our data. In this case, the emphasis is on what the data is, and we're going to, again, do most of our statistical processes. We're going to classify, we're going to organize, summarize the numerical data about a particular group of observations. So again, this is, we're looking at, in most cases, a sample, and we want to characterize the data that we have about that sample. In this case, we're not necessarily trying to measure the parameters, but we're kind of we're looking to sort of characterize the data that we have in this. Sometimes we might call this summary statistics. So we want to, I think exploration is what I always think of when I think of this initial sort of descriptive process. We're exploring the data. We are examining that raw data that we've got. We're looking to see if there's a distribution, and if that if the distribution is normal or if it's non-normal. And there are a number of different types of distributions that might fall into that category. We're trying to verify the accuracy of data entry. This is something we might do at this step. And finally, we're looking to generate some summaries of the data. Obviously, in many cases, we might have, thousands or tens of thousands of observations, and we need to have a way to summarize all those observations and see what they can tell us. So what are some of the tools that we can use for this? Well, there are a number, and probably the most common that we're going to see is the frequency distributions. So here's an example of a little frequency distribution. Maybe we'll kind of put him up there on the side, and we've seen this sort of thing before. These are all normal distributions, and we've got a set of parameters that we can take a look at in order to, I don't want to move that one. Let's just zoom in a little bit on this guy. So we've got, a number of parameters that we're looking at as we go through this distribution process. So we can see the, in this case, the mean, which is going to be where the midpoint of this data is, and then finally we've got the standard deviation here, which tells us just how broad this peak is going to be. And most of our data falls within, again, 3 standard deviations of the middle. So that's going to be somewhere like in here for this particular. So this is a tool that we can use to identify or just to get a look at our data. And of course, we would know that if we saw data like this, we're going to know a couple things just by putting it in this distribution. We're going to know what that mean is, and that's part of the central tendencies that we'll talk about in a minute. But we're also going to know how dispersed the data is. So there's a big difference between the the yellow curve and the blue curve in this case. So this is one sort of initial snapshot that we can take to kind of characterize our data. So let's go back here, and then we've got tables, and we're all familiar with tables. And a table is just going to be a collection of data in a tabular form. I don't know what else there is to say about that, but we've got our rows and columns, and we just see the data. And in this case, it's summarized a little bit. So this is our tabular form of data that we can make use of. So let's make our table nice and small right there. And of course, there are other graphical displays of data that we can do. And without bringing in an image of each one of those, we've got things like pie charts, where maybe we've got the different elements. That looks more like a peace sign than a pie chart. But we've got the different elements, and they're all maybe shaded a little bit differently. So this is our pie chart that we could make use of. We've seen bar charts where we've got this kind of thing going on. As we go forward one way or another, there's scatter plots, and we're all familiar with many of these, and thankfully the tools that we have can generate these very easily. So if we have our data in Excel, sometimes it's helpful just to generate a quick plot or two to see what we can see. And I think I mentioned Edward Tufte already once here, but let's just see if we can find one of his books. So one of his books is called Envisioning Information. And sure enough, here it is. So as you can see, it's I wish we could see a better. There's a better shot of the title. Here's just some different ways to visualize information. And so this is a one that's kind of neat here, the sort of the chloropleth map, where we look at the data across on a map, for instance. And here we have some other pie charts, and of course Tufte is one of the masters of data visualization. So this could be something that we could look at in a book like this to try to find some sort of novel ways to graphically display our data that might help us to get a better hold of it here at the descriptive level. Okay, with that in mind, we also have measures of central tendency. So this is going to be, again, if we look back at our distribution, that's that midpoint there. What is that midpoint? So we're all familiar with the mean, the median, and the mode. These are tools that we can use to measure kind of where the middle of the data is. And the measures of dispersion are sort of the opposite of that. That is not where is the middle of the data, but how broadly spread out is the data. So again, if we return to this image up here, the yellow curve is going to be more disperse in this case than the blue curve. So we've got different measures that we can use: variance, standard deviation, and others. And then some types of correlations also. If we look at our scatter plot, for instance, that might reveal to us some correlations. Now, we're not necessarily going to go in and try to do an in-depth analysis of variance or something at a descriptive level, but there might be some correlations that emerge that we could look at. And these are all things that we can describe in more detail. And in the discussion forum for the week, I've posted a couple links or a couple of required questions that I'd like you guys to look at and sort of develop. Let's explore some of these areas together.